we start perfectly on time. As director of the conference cycle, it's my duty and obligation not only to welcome our distinguished speakers and the chair today, but our outstanding and, let me distinguish public. In spite of the focus on the Ukrainian war, in spite of the traffic jams, you got to be here even tonight, in part in presence, part online. And I welcome both public very warmly. Okay, welcome everybody. My duty is just to welcome everybody and to underline the reasons why we did stick on the original program and kept this, let me say, a little bit marginal according to someone, but central in our opinion topics: digital revolution and shifts of global power, which regulating role of the European Union is an essential challenge for the process toward a common strategic culture of the European Union, coping with internal diversities and external challenges. We have had the opportunity during the last weeks to focus on external and internal diversity and external challenges. And today, we would like to underline how consistent the session about the digital revolution and the European role in this difficult context is for the future of the international role of the European Union. A strategic culture was remembered during the first session, you remember last October, by Jean Pisani-Ferry, is composed by different chapters: a growth program, which is the Next Generation EU, including a Green Deal and a digital project for a digital union. Is really an essential part of the European model in international relations. Secondly, we have had the opportunity during the previous conference to consider how the EU is really challenged by international power imbalances regarding the digital revolution. We will draw the attention, thanks to the excellent speakers, on the magnitude of this revolution, but in particular, the implication in terms of political threats, cybersecurity threats, and so on, in particular, which affect the role of the European Union, and in particular the European External Action Service as a coordinating institution regarding the digital challenges. So we decided to stick to the yearly program in spite of course, the attention of the media focusing on the Ukrainian war. That is normal. We will deal also with these tremendous and tragic topics, but we stick to the centrality of the digital role of the European Union for the international, let me say, leading, regulating role of the Union. And I take the opportunity to underline that the conference cycle will not stop here. We'll have the summer pause because in June, due to the 250th anniversary of this splendid academy, I say also on behalf of the secrétaire perpétuel de l'Académie, Professor Didier Vivier, that you are welcome also to the final part of the cycle, which will take place in autumn, and will include, let me say, a synthesis of the European Union approach to multilateralism. On the one hand, the role of the regions in multilateral cooperation. We have invited Louis Fawcett director of Oxford University. We have invited also Pascal Lamy, which is to be confirmed, for, let me say, the international trade agenda in the period of the WTO deadlock and the difficulty of the bilateral relations. Someone are going in a splendid way, the one with Japan. Someone are suspended, like the Mercosur and the China arrangement on investments, comprehensive arrangement on investment, and others. So the international trade agenda is crucial for the European Union as a tool for shaping global governance, and we will see how it interacts with the environmental issue. And finally, we will have, I hope, the opportunity to discuss about the future of the pan-European order after the war. I hope one day this tragic experience will come to an end, and we will have the opportunity to have a very exciting session about the relations with the Eastern European, the eastern part of the European continent. Finally, we will have the honor to invite the one who is providing us with the haut patronage, Josep Borrell, Vice President of the Commission and High Representative for Foreign Affairs. He just published a book on his own experience, and he will be invited to discuss with us about the outcomes of the Cycle 10 conference, interacting with let me say, the insights, the stimulating input provided by let me say, international scholars we invited. So I leave immediately the chair to a competent person, because I'm not, among my poor experience, I don't include the digital issue, and we decided to ask for chairing in a very competent way David Ringrose, who is the European External Action Service responsible for the Global Gateway Strategy and the development of digital technology, is a key component of the foreign policy of the European Union, of the strategic autonomy, I would say, of the European Union. He has a career at the European Commission, DG Connect, DG Relax, and he has an interesting international experience and an academic background at the University of Kent, in Canterbury, and Collège d'Europe, and à l'Institut d'études politiques de Paris. Please, David, you have the chair. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, for chairing in a very competent way the panel, which will start with an outstanding scholar coming from Klingendal, The Hague, and discussed by the director of the Berlin Institute for Digital Issues, Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar. Thank you so much, and David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Director. Thank you, Mario. So welcome today. It's good to see we have, as is the format now, we have a mixture of people in this very nice hall and people online on LinkedIn and Zoom. So just a word about the format at the beginning. We'll have a presentation firstly from Maaike Okano-Heijmans, who's currently at the Klingendal Institute in The Hague, and she has a long experience working on digital issues, the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, on the EU, on geopolitics and so on, with a particular specialization in Asia. She has experience in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, and she has a PhD from Antwerp, just up the road, and masters from Amsterdam and Waseda University in Tokyo. And then we will, after following Maaike's presentation, Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar will say a few words from her point of view. and Heli has recently joined as director of the Digital Society Institute at the European School of Management and Technology in Berlin. Before that, she had long experience in Estonia, and I think was one of the key people in developing what is probably a key element of brand Estonia as the biggest little country in the cyber world, working in the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense, working in NATO and also in the European External Action Service on cyber issues since that fateful day in, I think, 2007, when Estonia became one of the first places to undergo a massive cyber attack that made people realize what we were talking about. She was a scholar at the George Washington University in the States and also studied in Tallinn. And I think these two presenters today show how important, if you're going to understand the digital world, how important it is to understand both the academic perspective, the think tank perspective, the practitioners and so on, and how everybody needs to work together in this area, if only because there's not that many people capable of working in this area. So I think we should have a good discussion. And then after that, I'll open the floor for questions, either from the floor or online, and our colleagues will pass the questions online. If you're posing a question on Zoom, please identify yourself. Also, you can pose questions, I think, via LinkedIn. So we hope to have as many questions as possible on the subject today. So without further ado, Maaike, I'd ask you to take the podium, take the microphone and give us a song? No, or you prefer to do a presentation? Yes. You want to go up here? And so
maybe you have them?
we have some slides.
Thank you. Yes. If the slides work, that would be wonderful. I was a little bit late in sending the slides to the organizers, I have to admit. So I'm still hoping that it will work, and if not, at least now I have my notes also. So thank you very much for this wonderful invitation and for the very generous introduction. It's a great honor to be here and to be talking to you, an audience, of course, here and online. So finally, we're meeting again in person. But of course, the online environment is wonderful to reach a broader audience. So I'm really happy that we have this hybrid environment. And talking about the digital revolution, I don't think indeed is a marginal issue, and I think it does relate also, or there are lessons learned from the war in Ukraine. That also make this of relevance. So I will be touching on that as well in a minute. But also I would like to engage with the title actually of this meeting, which is of course in the EU's regulating role. And one of the key points that I would like to make today is that actually this EU regulating role is only one of a diversity of a set of actions, I think, that we have to undertake in this digital revolution that is coming at the same time as this global power shift. It's not just about regulating, but it's also about protecting what we have here and what we cherish so much in the EU, in our societies and in the internal market, as well as about promoting, and that is about taking our norms and values abroad and helping others also to defend what they cherish, of course. So that's one of the key issues that I would also already like to warn you, I guess, about. That is going to be a bit more than just the EU's regulating role, because we all know that, well, the EU has been fairly good at regulating the internal market. I think there's many examples that we will definitely discuss in a minute also, but we have to look beyond that. I always like to think of the uncomfortable areas, and the EU regulating role, we're actually pretty good. So I think we also have to, make that clear and take that abroad. And we have been doing that, but we can do a little bit better still. Because in the end, this is really about our own future. It's really about the foundation of our own societies, where we had an internet that was, of course, more common in the 1990s, and that came with a lot of hope for openness and for prosperity and for global connections. And we've seen in recent years that there's many challenges to that. Openness online, freedom of speech, and freedom to access all data is, of course, being diminished in some countries. Also, we see increasing surveillance. The technologies are used also by some governments to surveil their own citizens. And that's definitely an environment and a sort of a development that few of us had expected. Sometimes it reminds me of Alfred Nobel and Einstein, who had great inventions and then also realized that they could be used for not, the intentions that they actually had in mind. And I think it's really on us to now engage with all those techies, including, the Nobels and the Einsteins of today, to engage with them to help ensure that our future is indeed still in the open and interconnected world rather than in the closed society that we're also seeing, as I said, in some countries. So the next slide will show us a little bit, I guess, of that. If they work, please. Yes, wonderful. And a key challenge that I would like to, or a key question that I always have in mind here, as I said, is do we protect those universal or those liberal values and the systems underpinning it, or do we lose them? And I know that, of course, if we talk about power shifts and about digital revolution, you easily get drawn into the debate of US-China tech supremacy and the competition for tech supremacy. And where does the EU fit in? But I would like to really reframe that question and really just, focus on ourselves. Because obviously this has to do with the United States. Obviously this has to do with China. They are key players, as I will show in a minute. But this is really about what society do we want for tomorrow. And I think that's what makes it so relevant for today. That's why I think all of us here believe that this concerns all of you and that it is also very much foreign policy. And it's not just something for techies or for a small number of people in some basement that have been building this whole digital domain for us. So if we go to the next slide, I will illustrate how, looking at where we stand today, you will see that it is very much, China and the United States, they are the key players here. If we look at the markets, the platforms, economies, the Apples and the Alibabas of this world, you see that about 80% of platform companies and stock market value, they are from the United States. And that's a bigger number than last year, I can tell you, because of the stock prices in the United States are more favorable today compared to in the Indo-Pacific. But still, it's about 80% this year in the United States, 17% in the Indo-Pacific, dominated by China. And it's small letters here, but that's the blue part. Alibaba, Tencent are the big ones from China. And then there's a little bit, there's a little bit for the EU, there's a little bit for Africa. So we need more of those companies because referees don't win matches. As I will show in a minute, we have been a great referee in the EU, but it was a Brussels expert actually who first said referees don't win matches. We need to have players in this game, and they are the standard setters of the future. So we need to ensure that we have more of them. Do we have them? The platform companies apparently today is very much dominated by US and China. Well, what about tomorrow? Then you can look at the unicorns. That's the number of small scale of scale-ups that have a value of more than $1 billion US dollars. Also here, we see it very much dominated. 500 plus come from the United States, about 180 from China, and then slightly more over 100 altogether from Europe, and most of them in the United Kingdom, by the way. What about the top investors in all those companies? Well, guess what? They also come from the United States. The second biggest investor here is Japanese actually, and then we have a few from China. So clearly, if the EU wants to be a player also, and not just a referee or a playground, by the way, then we need to change. And I don't think we really need to change investing even more in investment and or in innovation. We have top-notch research being done here in the EU, but we somehow fail to commercialize it, and I'll get to that point later on. So we can move to the next slide. So how do we get here? And how did the EU really come to the realization that this is a challenge that we must all together address? Because I do believe that the challenge is now visible, at least to the elites in most member states and in the EU itself. It now has to sort of trickle down to a broader audience that will, and broader group of experts and policymakers who will feel that this is not just, again, you know, a field for techies, but it's really something that's also foreign policy. It's also about the regulatory roles, and for Ministry of Justice and Ministry of Economic Affairs. So first of all, that was the clearest shift that brought things home to us, is the clash of capitalisms, as I like to call it, between, well, open and liberal systems, market-based capitalist systems, and closed autocracies. And this is, again, pointing to the US-China conflict. And that used to be in the Trump time, we used to talk about this as a trade conflict. Well, guess what? The tech conflict is even more difficult, because in the trade domain, at least, we have some organizations that try and still fix this. Well, they haven't been really working well, but at least we have them. And in the tech domain, there's very little established mechanisms and institutions so far. So we need more of that. And that's where a few years ago, when all of this became clearer, when also it became clearer that the use of technology is, for example, the Chinese government supported it, not just at home, but also in, for example, Cambodia and some other countries, where they're also planning to adopt some of those Chinese technologies, and where the standards are also taken on board, that this had, of course, those trickle-down effects. Then came the COVID pandemic, where I think we all started to appreciate even more the digital domain and the digital connections, right? I think that they were a lifesaver, obviously. So everybody saw opportunities in digital connections after we had seen, you know, the tech conflict develop. This brought home the connections as lifesavers, but also exposed tech dependencies. You all have read in the newspaper, obviously, a lot about the semiconductor, for example, value chain, and how we need to reorganize them. Not so much only, you know, bringing them back home. That would be too costly and too difficult and too much of a long-term agenda, but diversifying. And that is, of course, what we are still working on also. But here we saw that this great event of our lifetime had very much this digital and tech element in it already. And the same with the war in Ukraine. And I think what that exposed was also the digital connections as a challenge, because we saw, well, David already referenced them, cybersecurity issues, and attacks on certain countries, the use of dis and misinformation to, you know, promote either side of the war, depending on where you stand, and then there's the digital finance element. So I think we have here, again, a very, you know, digital link to the very current developments that should bring home to us, you know, the size of the challenge here. But how do we deal with this challenge? That's the next slide that will help sort of show where we are. This is from a study that I did at Klingendael with a few colleagues a few years ago. 2020, I believe, if you could turn to the next slide, please, where we see evolving positions of like-minded countries in how to deal with this. And you can see how the United States had been looking at, and this was, again, from engaging with scholars locally in the various countries that we see here. So we worked with an American scholar, Indian scholars, Germans and French from the EU, and from Australia. And you see how the Europeans came from a very, well, open-mindedness towards China. Some call it naivete, about assessment of China's behavior being still very relatively peaceful, and wanting to engage China with open arms also in our own markets, to a more closed mentality. And I think that's the paradigm shift that we have seen coming also with the shift towards more industrial policy in the EU. Used to be a dirty word. Fortunately, I would say it no longer is. And we're finally also willing to protect what we have and ask of others also to adhere to the rules that we have here in the European Union. But we came from very far, and we're still, you know, not even with the countries that we like to call like-minded countries, and that it does, of course, include Japan and Australia and the United States. India, we are still not at the same page. And I think that is also important. If we talk about this tech challenge and about the digital revolution and global power shifts, how do we, understand that we need to compromise in certain elements, and where do we not want to compromise? You know, what are the principles, and how do we defend them best with what countries? I think that's basically a message that we should take from this slide, of the challenge that there is. And that's, I think, also why we see so many new platforms now being created, like the Trade and Tech Council with the United States and India even, and digital partnership agreements. There's many new formats that are being established to, even with like-minded countries, to discuss many of these issues and to get to the granular level of understanding each other and understanding also how we take this forward. Because after all, most people still, we don't want that splintering world, and we don't want decoupling, full-fledged decoupling. It will be targeted decoupling. And I think I was at a conference in Poland 2 weeks ago, and the Polish Prime Minister, I think, there put it very nicely. He said that, we should not only win the war, but we should also not lose the peace. And I thought we should really apply that also to this tech and digital challenge that we're dealing with. We don't want a splintering world, because that ultimately will not bring peace in the way that we like to see it. So we have to invest actually also in making sure that other countries also will want to engage with us. Because Putin will have, he has united the West in a way that I think nobody actually thought conceived possible. But he has also, widened the distance between the West and the rest. And definitely, I think if we don't invest in this, and this highlights this, we will be more disunited. So that's a huge challenge, I think, that we should look at in the future. So where does the EU stand? The next slide, I think, has a very nice figure or an illustration of that. And highlighting the various roles that all of us play, everyone plays in this tech domain and digital domain. We can be either a player or a playground or a referee. Again, I already mentioned that. If you could please show the next slide so that we can hear this or see this visualized. Then you will also see the EU's digital compass. And definitely David would be better able than I would be to explain all the details of that. This was published, of course, last year. And it then still was very much focused on the EU internally. So as a way of illustrating, I think in the EU internally, we are working now on improving skills of all people in the digital domain, of making sure that we have all the infrastructures available to all people, so an inclusive digital domain, that we do equip our businesses, and that also not just the big companies, but also the small and medium-sized companies, that they can actually digitalize and reap the benefits of the digital age, and that also the governments invest in what we call now a digital identity, for example, to communicate with citizens. Those are the four, in a very brief, of course, the four elements of this compass that I think, was a really great vision that the EU put forward. The challenge is, of course, now can we also take that abroad and help other countries also to benefit from this and in all these different elements. So that brings us, I'd like to flesh out in a little bit more detail the three elements that I mentioned, I think are where the EU is acting and where it can still act more in the regulate, in the protect, and in the promote domains. So the next slide has the regulate. Oh, no, first we have actually another slide showing the differences again between the various approaches to the digital domain. As I said, as was clear from this this other illustration with the different like-minded countries approaching the digital domain in different ways and having different understandings of how to deal with China's tech challenge. Those stem actually from differences in fundamental approach to how do you deal whose interests really should prevail in our approach to the digital domain. And putting it in very simple terms, here is where we see that in the United States, it's mainly business interests that prevail. We see there the US government, for example, or to give the best example, is very hesitant to regulate big tech. Whereas the EU has been very much asking, obviously, and trying to engage with the US government on getting more regulatory action in this field, so that we have not just the big monopolies, but also more power to smaller companies. And that, of course, involves in how you deal with data, right? To what extent should those companies also be sharing some of the data that they gather so easily because there is no regulation for it? So far, the US has been very hesitant, and that's why we, sometimes characterize this business interest first. Now, how does that compare to China? No surprise, I guess, to all of you who know China, it's the state interests first. It's really the state that is wanting to control the data and to make sure that it can use it when it wants to, also to surveil and to, to suppress its citizens even. Examples in Xinjiang, of course, come to mind here. And the EU in recent years has been very active in offering an alternative to those two, focusing on what we call a human-centered approach with the European values of openness and rules-based order and freedom of speech online also. All those rights that we are so comfortable with in the physical domain, they should all also be inserted in the digital domain. And that's what is the EU-centered, the EU's human-centered approach is about. And I think that's the challenge now, is how to convince also other countries, if they are not yet, of the value of this approach, and where those countries are convinced, actually to help them also to implement it. Because many other countries would also agree that this might be the preferred approach to more or lesser extents, because usually countries in an earlier level of development will want more state involvement, not so much to surveil their own people, but to help develop the bigger companies that will also lead to economic competitiveness. So there will be differences here, but I think we have to engage and to really localize our approach in working with those countries. So then the next slide should have a little bit more detail on the regulatory action that the EU has been in. So I think we can turn there right away to the next slide, please. It's a great overview from a German think tank, actually, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, who put out a paper earlier this year with this very nice overview of what the EU has been doing. Because let's also, be very frank and be proud of what we have achieved. I think sometimes, that's sort of missing in some EU member states. And internal market standards and on digital sovereignty, technological sovereignty, data sovereignty, that's how the experts here have distinguished the different elements of EU regulation. And it shows the wide diversity in the EU trying to regulate the markets, making sure that we don't have just a big tech becoming more and more powerful, but ensuring also that we have smaller companies, ensuring also the freedom of speech online, and many other things that you will perhaps be familiar with. And this has, of course, been labeled the Brussels effect in a famous book by a non-European author, by the way. It took a non-European to highlight this. Does that mean that all is fine now and we can tick the box for regulatory action? No, of course not. There's still a lot in the making and a lot more to be done. And I think Heli will be also perhaps expanding on the points that a few of the points here. For example, we need also more steps towards the digital union. We need international harmonization, because if the EU is all aligned, but we don't connect well to other regions, that's going to be very tough. It continues to be very tough for all those multilateral companies working throughout the world. And there's digital trade agreements. Where do we stand there? I think Singapore has made itself into a hub for digital trade agreements, working with New Zealand, Australia, some other countries in that region wanting to join. Are we willing also to go that way? I think those are important points that we need to really be discussing a little bit more. Then next, what about the protect field? At home, of course, also, as I said here, there's been a lot of work done already on FDI screening, on export control, anti-coercion mechanism. This is where the EU has been very active and, engaging the member states that have been more, quicker and not so quick sometimes in implementing also action. But it's actually happening already. And with others, there's cybersecurity cooperation ongoing with, for example, the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. It was the first element of the digital field, you could say, that we engaged with was in cybersecurity. This is what we're very good in. And I'm sure that we will hear also from Heli a lot more about this. And there's, of course, also this issue now of trusted supply chains, again, brought home by the challenge of COVID, and then again. So we're working on this, but still many things on the agenda. I think there's a great opportunity for more information exchange here, for more best practice exchange of what other countries are doing in the field of export control and FDI screening, of course, knowing by what standards you assess these foreign companies is really important. Knowing where they are actually based, if even if financial streams don't always show that immediately, that's really important. And how do we build communities where we have a more trusted environment, where actually all these important actors that include companies also and non-governmental organizations, how do we create an environment where there actually is a sufficient level of trust that will allow a good exchange of information and of opinions here? That is, I think, also really important. And then finally, the promote agenda. This is where also we see quite a lot being done, at least on paper. And I think where we will need to see most of the action coming towards the future. That's the promote agenda. And here we see there's need for real players, as I said, and called valorization of innovation. So as I said, we're doing a lot of, we have a lot of hubs for great research in Berlin. In my own country, Delft University is, of course, a technical university of an extremely high quality in, for example, quantum. But how do we make sure that we don't just have the knowledge, but that we also have the companies making use of that knowledge? Because those companies will use the technologies with an ethical understanding of the technology sector that will help spread European ideas of openness. So can we perhaps have more companies that make it easier to implement for people to implement their rights under GDPR, under the data protection legislation, for example? Can we have more of those so that we have the European ideas really implemented also through those companies? That's, I think, a next challenge for the future. And that requires, of course, also that we have more experts and more companies who actually stay here. Because sometimes we have the beautiful, companies, startups that are then bought up by, American companies or investors. And that is, I think, a real pity. Also, we see some of our best minds going to other places and across the big pond, for example, where I think it's more attractive in terms of salary, in terms of environment, where there's more of an understanding of the urge in, and the need to develop and to become digital players. So I think we need to also shift that mindset here in the EU, and that's a huge change. But again, small steps along the way, I think, are needed. Global Gateway is, of course, the label that was given last year to the EU's action abroad in this field, including in this field. It was not just digital connectivity, of course, but also other fields of connectivity. I was very happy to see digital elevated here to one of the most important elements, because this is what the needs in many countries throughout the world are. If countries in Southeast Asia or in Africa want to develop, they need to also make the most of the digital transformation. They need to build economic competitiveness in the digital domain. And that is, I think, what we can then help them with and what Global Gateway should be helping them with, also by building and offering infrastructure. That's one thing that keeps coming back when I talk to people in those countries at an earlier stage of development. What they need is, first of all, the infrastructure. So we need to find ways also to, we have European champions here, and can we please also make sure that they are more of a player in other countries as well. Finally, I'd like to close with a few ideas on how to do this. Well, the Brussels effect and make use of that is, of course, really important. Understand that this cannot be done through established institutions, but that we have to be flexible in networks is another one. Multi-stakeholderism, I already mentioned. There's a need to engage more with the private sector, with non-governmental organizations, again, especially also the techies that are out there and that have organized themselves, because they also now realize that their technology is being used in ways that they had never intended, and they want to do better. Internet Society is one great example, I think, of that. And then make sure that we use all those, strengths that we have in implementing our principles abroad. So I'd like to keep it to that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd love to hear what Heli has to say.
Thank you very much, Maaike. You've given us a huge amount to think about, both in terms of where we've got to, the challenges that are accelerating, I guess, accelerated by COVID, then accelerated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine as well, and a few pointers about where we need to go now. And Heli, you've spent a lot of time not just in the digital world, but particularly on cyber as well. So perhaps there's some more there that you can say about the challenges and that are facing us, but also perhaps about what we need to do in order to respond. So over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for your excellent speech. It was really good to see this kind of overarching view on where we are right now in Europe. Well, certainly we might start looking for the reasons why we are falling behind in terms of technology and digitalization in Europe. But the fact is that we are falling behind. Even the average of the OECD, when you look at the numbers, we are, some countries are doing fine, but not all EU countries are doing well in terms of digital transformation. I'm not going to analyze the reasons, but maybe just throw here some numbers, what we could achieve with some additional effort maybe. For instance, if all the countries collectively would invest more into digital skills, into digital infrastructure, as well as digital transformation of businesses and public administrations. And in order to achieve this, we should invest like 75 billion each year in order to achieve the goals of European Digital Compass of 2030, which Commission actually has set as a goal. I think one of the goals there is like 80% of the public services have to be digitalized in all EU countries, and majority of the people in the European Union should have the electronic identity cards by 2030. So in Estonia, which is my native country, we have the electronic identity cards used by majority of the people already for 2 decades. But certainly this is not the case in many European Union member states yet. So we are still hesitant. We do not have the digitalization as the maybe highest priority, especially now with all the other geopolitical challenges happening in Europe too. And we should maybe cluster our next steps into certain priority areas where to concentrate our efforts, because just going around to conferences and whining to each other why we are not digitalized enough and how we are falling behind the US and China, I think is not a good strategy. So although we have to speak about this, of course. I think what we need to overcome here in Europe is the deficit of digital trust. Not all European countries have this understanding that the digital technology could be trusted. And I think this is maybe one of the major reasons why we are not there yet in terms of digitalization. I live in Berlin, and it was interesting to see when you wanted to register yourself, you had to show physically up in a office with 7 different signed papers in order to become a resident of Berlin. And this happens in 2022. I'm not criticizing the Berlin Senate or the local government there, but certainly there is a technology available, and there are all sorts of solutions available to make these easy procedures more accessible for the citizens. But what is lacking, I think, is the understanding that we can trust these systems. And I think this is the biggest problem what we have in larger EU member states, the deficit of trust. How we are going to restore the trust is a good question, because in recent years we see more and more challenges when it comes to the digitalization. Well, coming from Estonia, that I think had an interesting test in 2007 in terms of digitalization. We had large-scale cyber attacks against our e-governance system and our online services. Interestingly, this did not diminish digital trust in the society. And I think it's a quite psychological concept, this digital trust. It does not have only the qualitative elements or quantitative elements there. Estonians had, even after 2007 cyber attacks, which are the largest cyber attacks against the entire nation ever happened, they still had digital trust preserved after this. And possibly it comes also from all the cultural or whatever other factors, but I think one of the issues what certainly has helped Estonians to restore the trust very quickly was the understanding that because of those high impact and low probability events that can happen in your life could not be eliminated. It does not mean that you cannot go on with your normal life as you wanted to go. It's still that, we know that the planes are falling down, we take still the airplanes. So I think it's the same with digitalization. If we are going to look for 100% secure systems, we never get there. So we have to, as societies, make some sort of informed risk analysis. What is the level of distrust in the system that we can live with and still go on with the digital transformation? And distrust is there. We cannot deny it. There are many challenges. Well, I have been working on cybersecurity for the past 15 years. So I can list you the very long list why we have the distrust. We start with the ICT technologies, of course, because they are not made to be secured. And safety and security was never the first element when internet was invented. It was never the first thought when the software and hardware in information and communication technologies companies was produced and developed. So we still have intrinsic problems with technology. It's a new technology, it's still immature. So we can do better technology-wise, we can do more security by design, we can do better secure ecosystems. It takes time and money. Right now we are operating in a situation where most of our software which we are using is full of the vulnerabilities. And that's how the cyber attacks are possible. The numbers we are losing in our economy because of cybercrime are, I think no one properly has really counted all the losses, but the number that comes up quickly, quite often is 4.5 trillion annually we lose because of the cybercrime. Crime as service, ransomware is a new digital plague. I ran a large conference 3 weeks ago in Berlin with the best law enforcement experts in Europe and in the US. And there is no solution for ransomware and crime as a service because the private sector is not reporting enough to the law enforcement. Law enforcement doesn't know what actually happens. And criminals are exploiting our own governmental and private sector lack of cooperation. So this is a very important field for cyber people right now, how to fight with ransomware. Then we have certainly also the problem of human rights abuses. We know the numbers of those countries who are censoring internet is growing every year. There is a very good index, which is the Internet Freedom Index. Iceland and Estonia are the leading countries in terms of internet freedom, and China and Iran and the rest of them are in the other end. So then we have, of course, the fear that our democracies are disrupted because of the possibility to exploit the vulnerabilities within the social media field. So everybody knows about the Cambridge Analytica scandal and exploitation of the Facebook users for the political purposes before the US elections in 2016. But there are many other examples like this. And I think European Union has certainly done, and European Union member states have certainly done a lot in order to protect their democracies better now. But misinformation and disinformation is still there. We still have Russian channels showing their programs in European Union in some of the member states. It's part of the package 6, which hopefully will be then adopted tonight to ban all the channels, not just RT, but the other channels like Russia Today, not Russia Today, but RTR Planeta and the others. They are still showing in the European Union member states now, 3 months after the war has started. So you see, we are not completely there yet, even with our own understanding what should be done in terms of misinformation. And then one more important element that we have in this whole conundrum is the uneven regulation. And I think this is something which the EU has started when it comes to the digital regulation. So the platform regulation has now been politically agreed, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act. The EU has been doing lots of cybersecurity regulation. There is the Network and Information Security Systems Directive number 1, which is an old one, and now the number 2 is also coming out soon and has been agreed 2 weeks ago in Brussels, which are good steps forward in order to increase the digital trust. But the digital trust is something we need to invest into the many elements there, and there is no one single magic bullet how we can achieve it. Of course, there are also the more geopolitical and the important elements at play. Cyberspace is the place where geopolitical interests and competition takes place. There are also some interesting new and good elements there. We saw how European Union member states came together over 5G issue, which was unprecedented. Commission, first time ever, was somehow overcoming the old rule that they are not really meddling into the free markets, and task the member states to think about the risk management in the 5G technologies. So, and all the member states then started to look around how could they find the possibility to avoid high-risk vendors in their 5G networks, the new telecommunication networks. And I think majority of the member states have done it by now. They have found some regulative ways or legal ways to basically exclude Chinese technologies from the 5G networks. So, of course, European Union has been building bridges with the other parts of the world in this field, and there is a number of the digital agreements, there is a number of the cyber dialogues. Cyber dialogues exist with the US, Japan, South Korea, India, a number of others, and the EU also talks with China on this issue, because China is a very important partner, we cannot ignore them. And maybe just as a last point, what I, as an educator right now, in my new role, working at the university in Berlin, I should stress is that we are also lacking our common priorities on education. And this is something which EU cannot do, because the educational policy is the national policy field. So EU doesn't have competence in this field, as Brussels people say. So every nation is muddling through the challenge of how to create more skilled workforce in the fields of digital, tech and cyber. And I think if we can have one good financing instrument or pledge from the Commission, from the different bodies of Commission here in Brussels, to pay more attention to skilled workforce, what we need in this field, then this would be a very good step forward. Plus, of course, money for the researchers. So, thank you. I stop here.
Thanks very much. That was a very... Thank you. So that was a nice counterpoint to what Maaike had to say with some numbers, and I'd be very happy to open the floor to questions. But perhaps first I can take my role as moderator and ask the first question, because I was particularly struck by your point about trust as underpinning a lot of this. And of course we talk about trust a lot, trusted connectivity, trust and so on, and it means a lot of things. But if I could be a bit provocative here and say, are we talking about a difference in trust between the private sector and the public sector? Because if you look at the amount of money people were spending on e-commerce during COVID, everybody was getting out their credit cards, giving their credit card details, their home addresses, their phone numbers to every company to bring them all the things they needed because they couldn't get to the shops and so on. And we look at the amount of the boost in e-commerce and all of the big companies and the platforms dealing with that. It would seem that there's no deficit of trust there on the part of our citizens towards these companies. But is the problem that there are other parts of the system that they don't necessarily trust? Do we trust the government less? Do we trust government institutions, post offices, and so on? Or is it a more complex thing, or does it vary according to countries? And if so, what can we do about it?
I was referring to lack of digital trust as a possible problem why the different EU member states are not really progressing with the digital transformation. So I think that was my major argument. And there are many elements why this lack of trust is happening. Yes, I think certainly when I'm looking back what Estonia did 2 decades ago, introducing the fully digitalized public services and introducing the secure digital identity, which was the basis of the digital trust that is in the society right now. And 2 decades ago, we had totally different mindset in the discussion of digitalization, because internet was seen as some nice space for the researchers and largely good people. And all the problems now what we have and challenges what we have in the digital domain has not really arrived properly yet to everyday understanding. So And maybe now we are in this very difficult juncture with the development of the digitalization, where we have seen the challenges in most of our countries. It's of course good that all the citizens during COVID were using the e-commerce and so on, but how many of them lost their data, the credit card data, to cyber criminal actors, we don't know, because the e-commerce companies never reveal this kind of data to law enforcement. So I'm not saying that e-commerce is not doing good job. They possibly do, and they secure their clients' data well. But we know that in the darknet there is a huge number of the credit card details on sale for the criminals every day. So and we don't know how this happened, whether it was the massive buying during the COVID or something else. So I think that the lack of trust is systemic, if I may say so, and the digitalization in Europe is lagging behind also, of course, because of our fragmented systems. So we do not have one United States of Europe, but we still have member states, and each of those member states have to do those decisions and have to consider the electorate and all the other political issues. And so it's possibly somehow related also to this perception of the electorate, whether digitalization is important or not. And I think there are huge differences between different parts of Europe there, right?
Yep, I think so. I'm sure everybody in this room reads the index which DG Connect puts out every year, the Digital Economy and Society Index, to see where their member state is on all of these indicators. And I think it's a very interesting index that comes out every year, looking at where individual member states are in terms of take-up of digital identity, amount of use of e-commerce, percentage of broadband, and so on. And it's interesting not just because it shows the differences, but it shows that while some member states are very good in some areas, they're very bad in other areas. And countries where you might expect to have more problems, actually they have really great broadband, but then they have less take-up and so on. And I think it shows, as you say, that we have a very fragmented picture. Huh? Before we go to questions from the audience, Maaike, I'll ask you one question. You raised, you said in responding to the opening words about the fact that everybody's talking about Ukraine, that there are a lot of lessons so far that we can learn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine about digital and why it matters and so on. Could you say a few words about what they might be and what you think we like to do? Are they different from the lessons we've been learning before, or are they just more about the criticality of these things?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, like the question on trust, which I was wanting to engage with a little bit also. Yeah, as I mentioned, I think earlier, I think the war in Ukraine and the use of the digital domain in that has really shown, again, opportunities and challenges that perhaps some people were not yet aware of, or it has amplified people's understanding of it. And yet, talking about disinformation and misinformation. Well, countries in, of course, neighboring Russia, they had been experiencing, the downsides of this for many years already. 2007 then was the first time, and then afterwards, of course, many other times. But I think here in this part of the world, we were not quite yet aware of or we were not acting on the acuteness of the problem here. So I think that level of urgency was really highlighted and brought home to us here. I think in that sense, it didn't highlight anything new, but it really highlighted the urgency of acting on it here also in all parts of Europe. Well, interestingly also, the cybersecurity, how to deal with that, misinformation, disinformation. So it's, again, different parts of the digital domain that are showing the challenges, because COVID, as I said, had highlighted already the many opportunities of it. And I think that for that reason it was important. I'd like to engage with the issue of trust, because indeed trust is used in many different ways. You mentioned trusted vendors. That's of course talking about telecommunications companies that are bringing digital infrastructure to many countries, and perhaps accessing the networks or using that also to to get information. That is one way of talking about trust, but the issue of trust between the government and or trust of the people in the digital networks and in governments that collect data through digital means is, I think, a very different one. That's a domestic issue of trust here. And at Klingendael, we did research also about what the average people thought, for example, about Chinese networks in the Netherlands or in Europe. And it was really interesting to see that, talking about those networks, they were saying, no, let's try and keep them out, and the government should actually, it's worth money to invest in that. And then we ask about, for example, about phones. Do you buy, does it matter to you where the phone is from that you buy? And people said no. Basically far less of an interest. And I think we need to really educate the people here that it's not just through those telecommunication systems that governments are investing in, but it can also be through your own devices. So that the data are collected by a company that must then be shared with the government if the government so decides. So here is, what you were, I think, also getting to, the level of distrust in government is sometimes, to my mind at least, disproportionate with the level of trust in private sector companies. I think this requires that we do a lot more explaining also to the people of how different systems can be used. And it's not just the big telecommunication systems that, again, the digital infrastructure that we all use, but it's also the individual devices. Well, that's here in Europe. Of course, in Asia, again, the region that I talk to with a lot of people and experts there, there you would see actually, the level of trust and concern with how data are collected and gathered is far lower. I mean, we don't see the really, the push from the public also in asking for stricter data security or data regulation or data privacy, as we know here. So I think, again, here in Europe, yes, we have very high standards, and we ask, I think, citizens ask way more of the government than they are asked of companies. There's a need to address that, but we also need to understand that it's different in other countries, and then helping those governments also make use of the how to collect data, or make use of the digital tools to help improve economic competitiveness of the country. Like the Indian government is also trying to collect data, and they are storing it in a way that is, really not very secure. So Indian citizens, they need to sign on to this digital identity. So I think at some point citizens will ask of the government that this is also secure. So even if they're not asking for it now, I think we can help them building those secure networks. And then, so towards the future, there's not that issue of trust that we do see here.
So presumably we need to help them build it, because at a certain point, otherwise something will come along and a disaster will happen, and then they will have to build anyway afterwards. I guess if there's a big data theft of the Indian electronic ID database must be one of the biggest in the world, and if that's hacked, then of course Indian citizens will be upset. But so we've talked a lot here on the platform. I just wonder if anybody in the audience has any particular questions that you'd like to ask either of our experts. Excellent, yes. So the lady in the front and then the gentleman behind.
Is it open? Yes.
Yeah.
Should I stand up? Okay. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I am Barbara, and I am a Blue Book trainee at the European External Action Service. I have actually two questions. I will try to make them as concise as possible. The first is how can we make the European universities a driver for digital innovation in a similar way they are in the United States. Because universities in the United States are very much a driver for innovation. And the second question is, we are seeing very much that the globalization is becoming more and more shrunk, in a sense that it is getting slower and is getting more polarized, in a sense that we see states that are more or less friendly or unfriendly, and we choose to collaborate with them accordingly. Against this background, is there space for the European Union to implement a successful science diplomacy in the field of digital innovation? That's all. And I can maybe repeat the basic questions if they are not clear. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we'll take a few questions and then come back. So I think maybe the question behind, we'll take a few questions and then we can answer them together, I think is maybe a good idea. So, yeah.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. I'm also from the EEAS, from the External Action Service. I deal with communication and public diplomacy. And I have a question, in fact, which is connected to what you all said and also to the issue of trust and to what the previous colleague was raising. It's quite specific. It's about the decoupling. It was mentioned by you in the presentations. I think it's going to be central to the digital transformation. And to a certain extent, I mean, it's already happened. If you live in China, you already experience, the decoupling. I mean, you don't have access to the same digital environment that we do here. In the US, there's many scholars, practitioners, politicians who have already decided that they should go for the decoupling from China. Look at Russia as well. So what would be your perspective, from the European Union? I mean, how do you think we should address that? What would be your opinion as experts, as scholars outside of the EU institutions, how to address the issue of decoupling? How do you think the EU is ready for that or not? Okay. Thank you.
And then Alar, I think you had a question as well, and then we'll try to answer those.
Seems like the EEAS is dominating here. I'm also from the EEAS, from Policy Planning and Strategic Foresight. I was also going to ask you to say a bit more about decoupling. You talked about targeted decoupling. Maybe you could explain a bit more what you meant by that. But I also like to bring in more the geopolitical aspect here that I would like to see perhaps stressed. One is, we talked a lot about the EU as a regulatory power, but what about the possibility of going through multilateral institutions to create some order in digital transition globally? Is that still a prospect when you have the decoupling happening? And maybe perhaps you could say, where you see prospects for the EU, perhaps together with the US and either like-minded, either using existing multilateral institutions or creating new ones to try and keep some semblance of the global digital transition. And finally, on the bilateral relationship between the EU and the US, how do you see the TTC going forward? Is it really an attempt towards this kind of multilateralization, or is it purely aimed at China and getting market share? Thanks.
Okay, so that's a bunch of questions about, wasn't it Gwyneth Paltrow talked about conscious uncoupling, I guess, or targeted decoupling. I think, globalization is slowing down. Can we do science diplomacy? How about decoupling? Is it really happening? And then perhaps also multilateral, how can we work through multilateral institutions or plurilateral institutions, I guess, as the TTC would be. And then also a very domestic question about universities. And obviously what you're trying to do is to promote innovation, to make Germany a big Estonia, I guess. So maybe Maaike, you want to address the sort of the globalization decoupling points.
Yes, thank you. Excellent questions. getting to the point about universities, I think it is you were asking about also, right? How can we make them a driver of digitalization? I think that is a really fascinating question. That is where we can really, there's a lot of opportunities to act. And this is, to my mind, the first thing we need to do is to bring universities also in closer contact with the private sector to ensure that all the research that is being done is also put on the market. Within Europe, first of all, and then hopefully those companies will also go to other parts of the world. I think that requires an investment because universities, they sometimes, obviously also for understandable reasons, they discourage, especially in Europe, the connection or the use of research outcomes for commercial purposes. Because there's different interests, of course, and a clash of interest perhaps sometimes, but taking away those obstacles and making sure that we actually encourage universities to make use of all that knowledge that they have is, I think, a really, really important one. And as I said, I think already before, what is also required here is, I think, a different mindset where we also agree that, your first bankruptcy, is actually a one step on the way to a company that will be more successful rather than, a very failed attempt. So again, also here, if students, can be encouraged and are also allowed to fail, I think that would be make a really big difference. But this requires also involvement of banks, which of course, especially in Europe, are very strict on, if you have one failed, attempt at building a company, then you will actually get, a sort of a bad mark behind your name. Whereas, for example, in the United States, they would say that, well, after your failed fifth attempt, that's when you can please come back to us, and then you will probably be successful that sixth time. So that is again a different way of I think looking at how we use knowledge in the market, and that really starts from universities where people are really allowed to also make use of their knowledge. I think that's a really important point. The targeted decoupling, or to the point of decoupling, I think. This is, where, what is it really that you're talking about, I guess, the point that I was trying to make. Because if we look at overall, the US companies in China, they have not moved out of China. So if the United States says it is decoupling, well, this is not proof of it. And we have seen, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the American Chamber of Commerce put out this report saying that probably in a few years we will see, that investments in the United from the United States into China are less. But that's not really so much because of the United States encouraging companies to decouple from China, but that's because there have been less opportunities because of COVID and China's closing of cities and all the effects, ripple down effects. So that's what I was getting to when I say, it's not going to be full-fledged decoupling. Let's be clear about that. But let's also be clear and have a discussion about where we should be targeted decoupling, because in certain technologies where the use of technologies can be in ways that we don't encourage, that's where we have to be, or where we don't want dependencies. Again, the chips, of course, are the most prominent example of this. That's where we will see, obviously, decoupling and less dependencies. The splinternet is, I think, also what the other question was getting to. So not so much decoupling in the tech domain, but in the digital domain and in internet. And again, I think you will have plenty to say about that. And indeed, this is where we have seen already that China was making use of its market power and shutting some companies out or asking companies to act in certain ways, in different ways in different markets. And I think that's what we really should be looking at more closely. What I find really encouraging is that we have As I said, some of the techies, as I like to call them, the people with really the technical knowledge that have built our internet and that are now worried, where things are going, they are starting more and more sort of open source initiatives and initiatives for more decentralization. So less power to the big tech companies and more power to other players in this domain. And I think encouraging that could be a really promising way, and helping also others, because this is very much also coming from Europe and some in the United States. Bringing that also to third regions, I think will help ultimately also ensuring that we have less of that splinter net rather than more of that splinter net. We cannot, I think, prevent, what certain countries will be doing, but we can encourage some countries to stay on that open end of the internet, and that requires real investments. And I think the EU has been doing some of that already, but there's a lot more, I think, that we can do in this way from bottom up, helping other countries to ensure that their internet remains open. This is also being done, of course, in different multilateral institutions, the International Telecommunications Union, ICANN. There are various multilateral institutions where the internet and the future of our internet is very much on the agenda. New multilateral fora that came to my mind, at least when you were asking this question, is also in the WTO setting, where we see also efforts for more e-commerce, and a global supply chain forum, for example, where also the aim is not for decoupling, but for finding other ways to still ensure that we have connections between countries. So that's, I think, where the EU has been investing and should continue to invest in. And at the same time, I think what we can do more is, make use of those. For example, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, to work out also differences with our main partners, because that's the problem. Sometimes we've, thought of the United States as, not invested enough in ensuring that we are more on the same page. And perhaps we need a big sort of grand bargain here for what the United States wants and what Europe wants, so that we get to a common understanding that we can also bring to third countries. And I think that's really what the value is of the Trade and Technology Council. First of all, that it brought EU member states also together for a conversation about all these issues, because for many of these issues there had not been a platform, and now, in order to prepare for this Trade and Technology Council, all these working groups, all these meetings, EU member states are having to make up their mind and as a way of giving input to the EU and what they take to this Trade and Technology Council. So I think that as such was the first big opportunity that the Trade and Technology Council offered. Well, that's not really what it was intended for, but it's a great by-effect, if you will. And from what I understand, but I wasn't there obviously, the Trade and Technology Council now really focused on Ukraine and on sanctions. So yes, it is. It started off with the United States very much wanting to talk China. We now are talking about other the more acute issues in dealing with Russia. So hopefully that will be then a next meeting where some of that sort of the dust settles down and we can talk about the long-term issues, because we now really have a better understanding of where both sides stand. I think that was an urgent need for that to begin with.
Heli, as they say in Berlin, Stichwort decoupling, yeah? Science, universities, innovation.
On the universities in Europe, I studied also in the United States, and I know that the universities in the United States and in Europe are a bit different. Because in the US you mostly have those cutting-edge private universities that need to go out from this kind of academic ivory tower bubble, reach out to the market, reach out to the industry, work together with industry. There is also the tradition of the private foundations offering grants with no direct return in the US. In Europe, if we look how the higher education is financed, anyone working in university here right now? No. Okay, one. So the cycle, how you get funding in a large public university in Europe is something like 6 months to 1 year. So it's better to have 7 different academic articles than 2 conferences with industry, because 2 conferences with industry is like your hobby you do if you have free time. You are measured by the scientific measurement that you will publish something in your own small bubble where maybe other 25 people understand what you talk about. So, and I think this basic difference, how the public education in Europe is set up and how the academia is financed, is one of the reasons why it is difficult for us Europeans to be too innovative on these new topics, which are moving very fast. You cannot, wait for a grant for 6 months because something already, some breakthrough has happened in some of the areas. Of course, there are good models also in Europe, and I see many of those models implemented in Germany, where there is a lot of private Stiftung money thrown to certain technology universities and so on. So, but this is kind of not a mainstream model. So it happened very well. On multilateralism and issues of digital and technology, since the dawn of internet, we talk about multi-stakeholders in this sphere, because multilateralism means that we have to go to the United Nations and every country has a vote. And this is what we have tried to avoid in the development of internet. And this is how internet has been working so successfully and how it's still interoperable between the continents. Because if China had a vote on internet, well, we had very different internet than this one we have right now. And I think certainly there is lots of diplomatic activity going on. And believe me, I've spent last 3 years in all these virtual United Nations meetings, as you know. So, because Estonia was the part of the United Nations Security Council, and we mainstreamed cyber in United Nations Security Council. So this multilateral approach in the UN framework might mean that we will be stopped doing what we already do well. And we do not want to create a situation when every country gets a vote, because not all countries share the same values in terms of how the internet freedom and human rights on internet and online should look like. So I think this is one of the major issues. Of course, there are other issues about the standards. We already see the ITU trying to come up with parallel internet standards, which we don't like usually in the Western countries, because internet standards are good enough already as they are, produced by this private sector and civil society model. So we do not want to create multilateral internet, which is then based on this one country, one vote. Then the innovation will be going out from this. So certainly there are other places where multilateral frameworks might be important and useful, but this is just something what I feel I have to say, that in everything to do with internet, we have to avoid the word multilateralism.
Yes, I think maybe just if I could allow one point on this whole splinternet idea. We often think that the splinternet, it's Russia creating its own RuNet, and then it's China and so on. But if you look at early versions of the Declaration for the Internet that we signed a few weeks ago, 61 countries, the EU, member states, the US, Japan, some African, Asian countries, Latin American, and so on. At the beginning, this was linked to the proposed Summit for the Democracies, and it was looking a little bit like beginning a discussion that we should have an internet for democracies, and then there would be another one because China wanted to build their own and so on. Yeah,
unfortunately.
Yeah, and but we were very happy. I think if we get to this point where that you raised, Maaike, at the beginning, that we shouldn't just be talking about where Europe stands with regard to the US or China, but what do we want? And I think there very much the discussion, that the final version of the declaration was very much based on a discussion between the EU and the US, but we said, well, this is fine to have a discussion about internet and democracies, but we shouldn't start going down the road of approving a splinter net. We can acknowledge the reality, we can acknowledge the pressures on it, we know very well, but we want to be very clear in this declaration that we do not want a splinter net, and we want to show other countries in the world, apart from just the big ones, that an internet for everybody is the way they should go. Because this will be a competition, not just China saying, well, we'll have the internet for ourselves, but then they'll be saying to all of the other countries in the region, okay, come and join us with ours, and so on. And then that's when it gets rather dangerous, I think.
Can I add one element into this discussion? We very often dismiss Global South in these discussions. I think this is maybe the fatal mistake that the global, whatever, alliance of the internet made. There are very few countries in this global alliance from the Global South. I think it was only Mexico and maybe the few usual suspects. Because the Global South is in a very difficult position when you talk with them. They somehow are squeezed to choose whether they have to be loyal to the China camp or whether they have to be loyal to the sometimes these kind of extreme liberal views that come from some of the technologically leading countries. So they want to be somewhere in between, but they don't want to be subjugated to Russian and China views. They want still this kind of relative freedom, and they still majority of the population is suffering sometimes because of the lack of internet freedom, because of their the governments that are authoritarian, and it's a very difficult question, I think, and the splinter net certainly, if we are going down that road, will alienate more and more people in the Global South.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I think we were very happy to see that we had Peru, Niger, New Zealand, Global South, if you like, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Maldives, Kenya, Dominican Republic, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cabo Verde, all signed up in the end when the EU and the US got together. And I think it's a very interesting example of the EU and the US saying, look, we need to have a more inclusive approach. We need to get some members of the Global South to sign up for this. And so we've reached 60 in the end. Hopefully we can increase that number, but importantly as well, make it not just a declaration of governments, but also a declaration of the type of multi-stakeholder community that you talked about as well, because these are obviously important players. So that was a long set of answers to 3 questions. Do we have any? Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, citizens. Angelos Harlaftis, EPAFOS Advisors. I worked for the last 14 years on the edges of the technology in the space industry, on the defense, on the ICT, and my research, personal research, concluded that we are missing the point. The European External Action Service, I see that the title you are using here, it's a little bit outdated. Last 2 weeks ago, we had the Ethno summit, and we spoke with the Americans at the telecommunication sector that we cannot negotiate with them. The total value of our telecommunication sector, Deutsche Telecommunications, Italian, etc., it's 0.23 trillion. When the American giants, they have a value of 7-point-something trillion. How we can discuss, I told them. So our point is from 2008, we proposed to the European citizens exclusively, and the Mediterraneans, about the CNET, the creation of the European Internet, which according to the laws of the competition could join the user with the Internet of today, which is governed from the American army under a non-profitable organization. And for the links, because I'm also working on the cybersecurity, on the leaks of the black Internet, it's very simple. All the data of the citizens of the world are governed by two data centers on the east coast and on the west coast. Everything goes there. So they have everything, Americans over there. If we don't make this, the digital revolution, which already has begun by the Chinese, followed by the Americans, and we are trying to compete them, will not happen for us. So the global thing is missing the point. Putin and its allies is cooperating from 10 years, 15 years for the Euro-Asian policies, and they are preparing a lot of things which we haven't yet seen. We have seen only Ukraine. We haven't seen a lot of things. Yes, the question is very simple. The regulation, do you think that the regulation, we can compete the giants, and the technical giants, and we can compete the Chinese and the Russians, who we don't know what they are doing on the technical level? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I think I saw figures that at least 30% of Russian ICT specialists have left Russia since the end of February, and another 30% would be happy to leave, and quite a few of them ending up in Yerevan, in Istanbul, in Tallinn, maybe in Berlin, or I think the head of IT of Sber, who made Sberbank into a big platform, has left and gone to the United States. So I'm not sure if the Russian IT industry has a future we should be scared about. Huh? But I mean, you talked about, I think, data protection, for example, maybe privacy shield. How do you see that to have a very sort of practical response to that question? If you're concerned about the data of European citizens being held by in data centers in the US, what is your view on privacy shield and Schrems and so on?
I know that no person somewhere in the US or any other place on this planet is able to retrieve all the data and do some logical good conclusions about every single citizen anywhere. So this big data is in bulk somewhere in the servers. The data is also, I think, kind of diversified. It's not that somebody, puts in your name, Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar, and everything that I have done over the computer since I was, 15 years old, comes up. So this is fantasy. This is what you see in the movies. Usually the big data is a difficult place where companies are retaining it, yes. Also some governments are retaining it because of the laws. Russian government has the laws that all the Russian telecommunications data should be retained, the Storm 1 and Storm 2, so that when the time comes they can pick up all your crimes and ask some services for government. But the Western governments never do this kind of data collection that could be then individualized. So I think this technology just doesn't work in the same way. Where data is less and less significant now when we are talking about virtualization of data. So it is not like some sort of physical box like you had these paper cards in old days stored somewhere. No, data doesn't work like this. So I suggest that we make another session about data science and ask some real computer scientists to explain how data virtualization works in order to respond to that question, because I think I'm a political scientist. I lack all that computer science knowledge myself. Yeah.
Great. Maaike, you have a view on that?
Perhaps just briefly, if the point was also that, yes, we should not just be a regulator, I totally agree. That's, I think, where I started. We have to be also, we have to have companies that make us into a real player. And, well, in data storage and cloud services, maybe one element of that, yes, definitely. But I think we also have to accept the reality where we are today, and accept the fact that we missed the boat, and it's very difficult to catch up on some of the big tech companies that are in existence now, where I think we perhaps have more of a chance to get started really in becoming a true player, is in slightly more, not less ambitious, but at least smaller projects. So rather than saying the cloud services, except that we could be a player still in the platform, in services for like Zoom and what do they call? I forgot what's the name for that sort of services. We have WebEx. We have where's the first sort of European company that can help also connect us here in Europe, and I think that would be a good start. And there's other examples I think also of less of the not so much the highest authorities, but have different companies. And we should, I think, start there because that's probably we have a better chance of winning and building capabilities that will hopefully get us later on also in a better place in the competition on some of those more fundamental services.
Thanks very much. So we have some online questions, do we? Oh, this is the exciting moment. So let's have a look. Okay. Oh, great. Okay. So questions from the online audience. Let me just have a look. How do we make? Well, there's one point. It's a bit like the university angle, but how do we make the European digital environment attractive for workers and younger minds?
Well, younger minds. I think they are already full-time in digital, so I'm not sure that we have to help them too much. But how to attract them as workforce to work in the IT sector or on the issues? I think this might be the core of the question. I think that it's already attractive in some countries and maybe not attractive in some others. So. I think if there is a thriving digital innovation sector in the country, then young people find it very interesting to work there, and maybe that's what then governments have to then help to happen in the countries.
Okay. And another one, I mean, you've both worked a little bit in defense, so here's a question. How possible would it be for NATO and the EU to work together on digital issues?
On cyber issues, NATO and EU are already working together for many years. There are many formats of how they are consulting each other and working together. And also, please keep in mind that NATO and EU are the same collection of member states mostly. So it's not like there is a suspicious cabal somewhere in the headquarters of EU and NATO and they only work together themselves. It's the same capitals, it's the same member states, it's the same people who work together. So whether it happens here in Brussels or it happens somewhere else. So.
Yeah.
Indeed, on NATO, the fact that the cyber force has become the fourth force in the military in some countries officially already, and in some countries unofficially, I suppose, and others hopefully still to come, at least taking that threat seriously, and indeed that has made for the fact that it's also addressed within NATO. I guess, whether NATO is the right forum also to address China's tech challenge, because yes, NATO is of course thinking very much now also about how to deal with China. Probably, I would agree with the people saying that, that's probably better addressed elsewhere, where the real knowledge is, and let's not duplicate, much of that, recreating that within NATO. But of course, engaging with it is a different thing.
We have another couple of questions which are quite similar, which are about the overall effect of increasing digitalization. One question is that the premise is that it's something undoubtedly good and it's not to be questioned, and we should simply do more of it. How did we reach this premise, and how is it proven? And then another question related to that is that the experience of a lot of digitalization is that A lot of it means a lot of loss of privacy and a lot of money, and more state control, which is undermining our open democratic society. So a couple of points about the overall impact of digitization on the health of our democratic societies, if you like.
Well, I think I'm coming back to my point that I made about digital trust, and that's why I think why we are at the stage of not digitalizing faster in Europe, because our electorates and populations are becoming more hesitant to support digitalization because of the issues of trust we are seeing now in recent years. And how to overcome that, we have to, I have solution how to overcome. We have to first adopt a new generation ICT technology, where the security by design is already part of the system. Because with the old software, with the current stage where we are with technology, it is very difficult to secure this domain because of the technological base is not secure enough. But I think many people in universities and elsewhere are right now working on in order to create more secure digital ecosystems. And I hope that this kind of scientific breakthrough will also happen at some point, and then we can have this digital trust problem solved.
That's a very technical, scientific answer. So what you're saying is that people need to trust the scientists. We just need better scientists.
No,
and so on. Is there something about public debate here that we need?
We need to trust the system that we are using.
Yeah.
Like we trust the planes. You take planes, I take planes. So if you compare the ICT domain with the aviation sector, then every 10th plane would fall down. So if you have that kind of intrinsic problem with the technology, it's very difficult. Yes, I gave a bit geeky answer, sorry for that, but it comes, all the problems we have, not all of them, but majority of them, also come from the fact that the underlying substrate that our societies and economies depend on, which is software, is still full of bugs. Like bugs, vulnerabilities that need to be fixed. The companies are fixing them, but you know how the cyber weapons are built. Somebody finds a bug, sells it to the highest bidder, or maybe it's a government researcher, sells it to the cyber command, and then they create some nice tool how to get into your systems. The same is used by the intelligence services, the same is used by the cybercrime actors, and sometimes intelligence services and cybercrime actors are kind of the same in some countries, so it's even worse. So there is a huge underground black market for cyber tools, and some of those tools which are discovered in the software, the same software you are using every day in your nice office in Brussels, is full of the bugs. And somebody is maybe following what you are doing with your keyboard and everything. But since you are not blackmailable, because you are not, somehow interesting target for the intelligence services or criminals, they do not touch you. But if they wanted, for instance, to apply ransomware attack towards the Commission, which possibly they don't do because they are clever enough not to go after so big targets, but they would do this with a small company somewhere or the mid-sized company, ask to pay 50 million, and maybe the mid-sized company is paying 50 million because they do not want to lose the trust of the clients, and in order to get their data back, they would just have no other option. So, and this kind of situation where we right now find ourselves is not because we don't have people dealing with cyber issues. It's not because digital is somehow intrinsically bad, but we are not there yet technologically to have the domain that we can fully trust. So, trustworthy computing was a memo that Bill Gates sent in Microsoft around 20 years ago. Everything what is there in this memo still applies. So, go to Google and see the memo.
So, Bill Gates seems to be the answer to many problems.
He's a clever man. He knew this happens, but nobody has answered his questions yet.
The difference is he's made a lot of money since,
yes,
I guess.
And his own company is still producing software which is full of bugs.
Yes. Okay, one question from YouTube. iPad, I guess. A huge supporter of a good deed. It means implementation of digital identity. How do we do this, and how do we start? What about digital identity? What do we need to do in order to build back better using digital identities?
Wow. I'm not sure we have a good answer to that. Do you want to take that?
What I see interesting in Estonia, I mean, I used to work with one of the world's great Estonians, and was Ansip, and he was saying how the interesting thing is that usually one thinks that in the digital area, it's innovation happens in the private sector, and then the public sector adopt it. Whereas in Estonia, it was the other way around. He's a good storyteller. And that the digital identity was a government initiative, and it was taken up by the rest of society much more quickly than usual government
I think,
initiatives.
yeah, he's a good storyteller, and as a politician, he has to say that, of course. But actually, the Estonian case was very interesting. The government allowed the private sector to go forward and innovate, and supported the private sector at every step. This is what actually happened. So the private sector brought in this idea. The private sector, and why the private sector did it, I think, was also the, let's go back to 95. Estonia is newly re-independent. Soviet forces have left 94. Everything has to be created. There is no technology that Soviets had left there. So country has to be built up. So the organizations are buying off-the-shelf technology, state-of-art technology in 95, which is already quite, as you know, advanced. The banks and many other private sector companies have to then solve the issue of how they are going to use, or how they are going to let the population have the bank cards and the bank services to be used quickly enough and efficiently enough. So the banks introduce some of the security features, which are not yet the national ID card. This comes later. But the mindset of introducing the secure use of online services comes from the banking sector, actually, I think, at early stage in Estonia. And then the other companies are taking this up, and the government and the public sector and the private sector are working together on the solutions. And very important point, yes, is that the government is always supporting what the private sector is doing, and trusting the private sector that they are right, that they know what they are doing. So, and also government being quite young, the new generation of politicians and so on, approving some of the crazy ideas, what might have been at that time like, oh, good, innovation happens, it's great we do this, so instead of, oh, let's not bother us with these crazy ideas. I think there were many elements, but it happened together with the public and private sector.
Great. So, yes, please.
First of all, a question which has not been addressed, but in my opinion is important because it has been addressed by the Conference on the Future of Europe. 50,000 people took part, and the European Parliament and the French presidency by the Macron speech on 9th May. Is the digital union not only in its internal aspect, but as you said, in its promoting and external dimension, an argument in favor of treaty reform or not? Or we can do without any treaty reform. Treaty reform means qualified majority voting, expanded to all sensitive policy fields, including, of course, the Council of International Relations, where the veto players are very often blocking any resolution proposed by Borrell and so on. So this I understand that it is a divisive issue. It's difficult, but I would like to have your expert point of view about this. I take the opportunity, in order not to be boring, to thank not only the outstanding speakers and the chairperson, but the public and, let me say, a person who helped me so much in selecting outstanding speakers. For this session, I have to thank Alar Olium in particular. Thank you so much, Alar, for this very productive interaction between the Academy and the European External Action Service. Second, I would like to thank the 3 staff organizing this event, making it practically, technologically possible. The staff of the European External Action Service, Casillo in particular, the staff of GOPA, in particular Diana and Andrea, and the staff of the Academy, Isabel in particular. Thank you so much. Without you, nothing would be possible. I say that I don't want to bore you with a new question, but the single one remaining a little bit marginal was this one, the institutional side, the decision-making side, whether the reform of the treaty toward the qualified majority voting is needed or not. Thank you so much for all you did. And I learned a lot. I took so many notes. Thank you so much for teaching to us a very difficult topics, but crucial, because the conclusion I draw is that the digital union and the external projection of the promoting and regulating side of the European Union is essential for constructing a European common strategy, common culture, and in particular the strategic autonomy of the European Union. Thank you.
Okay. So, do we need treaty change? Maaike.
I think that answer is actually, really for you to give, David, because you passed that terrible exam that I did not pass in order to obviously, be a civil servant here. I think you need a good understanding of the treaties as such. I just want to perhaps end by thanking you so very much for putting this on the agenda and by noticing how far we've got without treaty change. I think if you look at all the new regulation that has come out, that has changed the union already, that is to me truly impressive, and I think this is still very much something on the way that we have to keep investing in and get more people on board with. That multi-stakeholder approach that you said, so much defines the start of the internet already. I think really has to be taken to a next level here, whether we require treaty change.
I totally subscribe what you said. I think in our field, in digital field, we are not only talking about the governments. For us, the public sector and the other actors are as much, sometimes even more important than the governments.
No, I think when you look at GDPR, this is an internal market piece of internal market legislation, like a lot of the legislation that we've been talking about. And nevertheless, that then becomes a product that we are selling quite successfully abroad. The Bella cable that we built between Europe and Latin America is great, not just because it's the first high-speed internet cable between the EU and Latin America, but because it's got GDPR on both ends of the pipe. Because it leaves Portugal, where we have the GDPR, and it lands in Brazil, that adopted also basically their own GDPR. It's basically a cut and paste. And what we're trying to do now is to then extend the Bella cable northwards all the way, west and northwards through Chile, Argentina, up through Central America, so we can extend the reach not only of the cable and the potential of Latin America to do business and research with Europe, but also to extend the reach of European legislation and to safeguard the data of Europeans and of Latin Americans along with the pipe. But I think So we've come a long way, as far as I can see. But the institutional issue, I think, I'm not sure we haven't reached any point where we've been so blocked that we would require treaty change. The Declaration on the Future of the Internet was an interesting example where we had a lot of discussion and a very fruitful cooperation between the Commission and the External Action Service in order to arrive at a text that was inclusive, as you said, Heli, that wasn't just, the EU and the US and the Five Eyes, if you like, and maybe the Japanese and the Australians, but that was inclusive, that was global, that met all the expectations of the member states, I think, and there's increasingly issues like that where we need to have the Commission, the External Action Service, the delegations, the embassies of the member states as well, all working together. I'm not sure that requires treaty change. The member states are all telling us that they would like to work more closely with us. They'd like to have better procedures to do that. They'd like more cooperation in Brussels in working groups and things like that. And I think for now, we've got a long way to go. We had a very good debate in July last year in the Foreign Affairs Council on the geopolitics of technology, and we hope to have the follow-up in a couple of months from now, where we'll be talking about the external aspects of digital policy with the foreign ministers to see what we can do more of, to see what we've learned. And I think, as you said, COVID has accelerated things massively. Now, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've realized the importance of cyber, of disinformation, of, if Elon Musk hadn't put his Starlink satellites up, the Ukrainian artillery would be a lot less effective in fighting the occupants. And if Ukrainian cyber teams hadn't been working very closely, likewise. And if the big Ukrainian e-government platform that we worked on with Ukraine, the DIA platform that was initially for e-government, but then basically the Ukrainians turned into a platform for people to contribute to the war effort, and if you like. So I think there's a lot we can do. A lot of it is unexploited, and we look forward to working with the Commission and the member states on this. But we also look forward to more great debates like this. So thank you very much from my side as well for the opportunity to do this and to the questions that we received online. And we'll come back again in a year and talk about the progress that we've all made. And there's a drink too. Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.